Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud while stoned. Today, we pick up part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1008, titled The Origin of Religion, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Alright, here we go. This is part 2, and we pick up at the beginning of chapter 3. Chapter 3 is The Real Roots of Religion. Where should we look for the lowest fragments of human family? Remember what we mean today by the human family. Savages are not degenerated peoples. Here and there, in particularly hard conditions, a tribe may have degenerated somewhat, but their language or some other part of their life contains traces of the higher level from which they sank. The overwhelming majority show no such traces on any scientific test. They are fragments of the race, regiments of the human army, flung off and left to stagnate as the race advanced. With each fresh advance of their other races, they were driven further afield. Men with better weapons and better brains pushed them aside and seized their lands. You look for them in sheltered islands, sheltered forests, and at the tips of continents. That is where we find them. They are the Yagans of Terra del Fuego, the Batacudas of Brazil, the Vedas of Ceylon, the Andamanese Islanders, the Atas and the Philippine Islands, the Samoas of the Malay Peninsula, the Tasmanians and the Bushmen of South Africa. These are admitted to be the lowest human peoples. They are not tribes. They have no tribal organization or chiefs. Most of them cannot count beyond one or make fire. In all, their culture and their physique, they are the lowest human beings. I have in my larger work, The Growth of Religion, summarized all that the authorities whose works are given say about them. Here I must very briefly quote what we know about their religion. First, let us take America. The continent was peopled by an invasion from Asia across a land bridge which formerly existed in Alaska. But a few peoples are so far below the Indian level that it is imagined by some that they crossed from Europe by a land bridge which, we know, once spanned the North Atlantic. It is, however, so many hundreds of thousands broke down that it is safer to trace all the inhabitants of America to Asia. The primitive, very early race of which we find patches today in Ceylon, the Andaman Islands, the Malay Archipelago, and the Philippines seem to have sent a branch over to America before the Great Ice Age blocked the Alaskan Bridge. The later and higher Indian invaders after the Ice Age drove them right south, and the remnants of them shudder today and die out on the bleak shores of Terra del Fuego, or wander in the dense forests of Brazil. In Terra del Fuego, there are three peoples. It is the lowly Yagans who interest us. They seem to have degenerated in many respects, but there is no trace of any degeneration from a higher religious level. Fortunately, they were thoroughly studied for 2 years, 1882 to 83, by two able French scientists long before modern ideas could reach them. And these men, Hades and Denneker, say, "We have never detected the least allusion to any kind of cult or religious idea." They quote a missionary, T. Bridges, who had before them spent 20 years amongst the Yagans. He says, "They have neither hope nor fear beyond the grave. For them there is neither God, nor good, nor evil, nor spirits to fear apart from the phantoms which may injure them in this world. Death is the end of existence, and they have no idea of a spiritual life or of the composition of man from a body or a soul." Here let me pause for a moment to point the bearing on another issue of religious controversy. It is constantly said that no tribe ever lived without a belief in God. Even Professor LBB strangely says in his psychological study of religion that this is correct. It is very far from correct. I do not see in any case what consolation a Christian can derive from the assurance that the very lowest of savages share his belief in God. It might perhaps be urged that this universal belief points to either a primitive revelation or an instinct in human nature. If the latter view be urged, we may say that an instinct which is so strong in the savage and so feeble, as my first little blue book showed, in modern civilized man, is scarcely entitled to respect. And if it be held rather that the universality of belief points to a primitive revelation, we can only regret that the revelation did not contain also a warning that worship should be kept free from bloodshed. Human sacrifices and all the monstrosities of savage religion. In point of fact, it is false that all nations or peoples believe in God. I have just quoted a most experienced and devoted missionary saying that the Yagans had no religious belief whatsoever, and missionaries never err on the side of rationalism. We shall see that not one of the peoples described in this chapter believe in any kind of God, or even higher peoples, whom we shall describe later, have no God or gods. The human race does not begin with monotheism or a revelation and degenerate from it. On every strict test of facts, it begins without religion, then believes in spirits of the dead, next in polytheism, and finally in monotheism. But in the quotation about the Yagans, there is a reference to phantoms which may injure them in this world, and it may be thought that here we have a rudimentary religion. Hides and Denneker also say that they found certain ideas that might be referred to superstition, though their origin was the fear of maleficent individuals. The Onegans attributed disease and death to certain wild men of the woods. Some of the Onegans had seen these horrible monsters, who sometimes stole their children and often descended upon them during the night. But there is here no religion. Hides and Denneker say, in the end, the Fueguans commonly believe that these wild men are the Alacalupas, and the Alacalupas are simply a neighboring people of higher culture. In short, the Onegans have little magic and no religion. They have never speculated on dreams, shadows, or powers of nature. Such was primitive man. Next, we turn to the Batucudos and other lowly tribes of central Brazil. These naturally are less isolated from other tribes than the Onegans, and they have borrowed much and are at a higher level. Yet Dr. A.H. Keene, a distinguished authority who studied the Batucudos, and tells us that they cannot count beyond one. Says that they merely regard the sun as a good principle, but do not worship it. The moon as a maleficent agent, and the storm as full of evil spirits. Beyond that, they have no religion. Other writers on them say curtly that they have no religion. It depends how you define religion. Other primitive tribes of Brazil were carefully studied by Professor K. von den Steinen. He found them great dreamers. They stupefy themselves with tobacco leaves in order to get vivid dreams. We are therefore not surprised to find that they are quite convinced that man has a double which leaves his body in the dream, and at death fails to return to it. As the professor says, when they bury a woman's implements with her and say that she will need them in heaven, they clearly betray the influence of missionaries. They worship nothing. In their legends, they talk of two very powerful ancestors and even credit them with the creation of fire and water. But when we learn that these myths are common in America, we must gather that they borrowed them from the Indians. In a word, they have no gods and no religious practices, but they have a firm belief in an invisible double of the body. This is closely connected with dreams, but not this particularly, but note this particularly, their native name for it is shadow. So, hydration. In the beautiful island of Ceylon, not far from the cradle of the human race, there lingered until recent years another of these patches of primitive humanity, the Vedas. Naturally, the island long ago attracted higher tribes, and most of the Vedas had adopted Tamil or Chingalese ideas and practices. These are, however, and were until quite recently, a few wild Vedas, and these have been thoroughly studied by two scientific men, Paul and Fritz Saracen. Their general culture is of the simplest known description. They cannot count beyond one, and their brains are relatively to their size the smallest amongst living peoples. We are at the primitive level of humanity. They have no religion, and only the slightest trace of anything that we could call magic, and not the least belief in any impersonal force in nature. They thus, like nearly all the peoples I describe in this chapter, do not fit either Fraser's theory of the pre-animalistic theory of the origin of religion. At the most, they have some awe of the sun and the moon, but it has no religious significance. They speak of a dead man as a yaka, and the Saracen brothers translate this soul. But it is, they admit, a Chingalese word, and the Vedas, who offer rice to the yaga, say that they is this merely imitate the Chingalese. Chingalese? I think it's supposed to be Chingalese. To the question whether the dead lived on, they replied that they did not know. They had never even reflected on the matter. There is a second important study of the Vedas by Dr. and Mrs. Schleigelman, but it deals with the Vedas as a whole, and it is acknowledged that they have adopted the Tamil religion. The pure Vedas, now almost extinct, have no religion whatever, not even a belief that man has a double which survives the body. Equally primitive, both in culture and language and brain, were the Aboriginals of Tasmania, who died out half a century ago. Here again we have a people not far removed from the very cradle of the human race, which was probably in southern Asia. They at first occupied Australia, but the present Australian Aboriginals drove them to the extreme southeast. This part was then cut off by the sea and became the island of Tasmania, and behind its ocean-sheltered frontiers they have retained the primitive features of the early human race until the 19th century. They had no abstract ideas or words, and their language was, in fact, so rudimentary and had so much to be assisted by gesture that they could hardly talk to each other in the dark. Fortunately, we have again here the testimony of a missionary of long experience, Dr. Nixon, the first bishop of Tasmania. He says, He says that the bishop, as later and more careful writers like Bonwick and Ling Roth show, is quite right in saying that they have no gods and no kind of worship. But they have plenty of religion, of an elementary sort, in their belief in malignant and destructive spirits, and it is most important for our purpose. The Tasmanians believe very strongly both in magic and in spirits. Neither belief seems to precede the other. The spirits of the dead, moreover, were malevolent and were greatly dreaded and never mentioned. It is clear that before the first traveler described them, they had vaguely adopted ideas from missionaries, as they said that they became white men after death. They had never seen a white man until the 18th century. It is, however, enough for us that they were convinced that man had a double which survived the body, and their native name for this element was shadow. Beyond this, they had only a certain feeling of awe for the sun and the moon, which they did not worship. Returning to the Indian Ocean, the probable cradle of the human race, we pick up another fragment of early humanity in the Andaman Islands. Andaman Islands. Andaman, yeah. Their ideas and practices, however, are very largely adulterated with foreign elements. For their islands lie in the tract of seafaring peoples, and their religion contains such obviously borrowed beliefs as creation, Eden, and a deluge. It is thus impossible to tell how far they have been influenced by others in their legend of a great spirit, Peluga, who lives in a stone house in the sky, his wife and family, with his wife and family. At all events, they have no nature worship and no belief in an impersonal force, but they intensely believe in the spirits of the dead. Since the soul is red, one may conclude that they got the idea of it from the colored double or reflection of themselves which they saw on the surface of water. I don't understand that. The Samoas of the Malay Peninsula are another dwindling fragment of the same primitive race, a race of small-statured black men, scattered in patches along the Asiatic Ocean and in Tasmania and South Africa. The Samoas, however, have admittedly adopted many ideas from the Malayas. They have a kind of deities called Kari and Pele, and occasionally they offer human sacrifices to Kari. In this, and in their magical practices and legends, we cannot possibly disentangle native from adopted ideas. It is enough that they believe intensely in the surviving spirits of men, and that the spirit is a small red object, which, after the death of the body, lives on in the water or the storm. In the Philippine Islands, the race, you see, spreads towards America, and gives us the clue to the Batacotas and the Yagans, or a few thousand additional primitive Negritos? Negritos, called the Aitas. Most travelers say that they have no religion, but they build fires to the full moon, not praying to it, so that Professor Brighton is not justified in calling it their chief deity. It is not clear, even, that they believe in spirits of the dead. The only suggestion of such a belief is in connection with their headhunting, but they have most probably adopted this practice from the Malay headhunters, with whom they have for ages been in contact. Lastly, we have the Bushmen of South Africa. These are what we may call the highest stratum of the primitive human level, and they have for ages been so closely associated with higher tribes and for a century with Boers and missionaries that it is difficult to get to their really native beliefs. They are often quoted as believing in a supreme spirit, Kaang, which created all things. But the chief authority on them, Dr. G. McCall Thiel, tells us that Kaang was not a god, and that they do not even clearly believe in a spirit which survives the body. He says, everything connected with their religion, that is, their dread of something outside of and more powerful than themselves, was vague and uncertain. They could give no explanations whatever about it, and they did not all hold the same opinion on the subject. Some of them spoke indeed of the powerful being termed Kaang or Kagu, but when questioned about him, their replies showed that they held him to be a man like themselves, though possessing charms of great power. Many are supposed to have a vague belief in immortality, but probably very few of them ever gave a thought to such matters. When we compare the statements of the other authorities, we come to the conclusion that they vaguely believe in the survival of some part of a man, for which they have no definite name. And they have very rich legends about ancestors, one of whom, Kaangu, is well on the way to become, in their memory, a sort of god, though there is as yet no clear reason to call him a god, and there is no worship. And that is the end of chapter 3. And we'll take a hydration. Cottonmouth. All right, chapter 4. How gods were made. An ounce of fact is worth a ton of argument. And there is, perhaps, no subject in connection with which it is more useful to remember this proverbial advice than the origin of religion. I have now put before the reader a collection of facts of the greatest importance and instructiveness. These facts are given us by men of the highest authority, men who personally and scientifically studied the peoples in question. There is, moreover, no dispute about the position of these peoples. They are the lowest fragments of the living human family. I have not space here to describe their life, their ideas, and their physique in detail, though a good deal of this is given in my larger book. But on every test, these lowly peoples are marked off from the rest of humanity as an earlier and lower stratum. They are surviving fragments, not of the earliest human family, by any means, but of a race far lower than the Australian black, a race corresponding to man of the early Stone Age, the man of more than 100,000 years ago. From the cradle of the race, they wandered along the lines we have indicated, and higher tribes have driven them into the islands and forests. They afford us a fascinating glimpse of early man just at the time when he was becoming religious. They show us religion in the making. There is no trace of primitive revelation or of a religious instinct. There is no trace of animism or pre-animism, and magic seems amongst them to develop equally with, not to precede, their rudimentary religion. What do they teach us? First, that there is ordinarily no belief in a God. It is only amongst the higher of these lowly peoples, or those who have been most in contact with higher tribes, that any sort of being stands out as particularly powerful, like Aang or Peluga. It is a stage, perhaps, in the making of a god, but there is nothing like worship. He is a strong man about whom they tell stories, as Britons once did about King Arthur, or the Hebrews about Samson, or the Babylonians about Gilgamesh. We will return to that presently. Some of these peoples cannot be said to have any religion at all, but they are all on the threshold of it, and it makes its first appearance as a belief that a part of man survives the death and decay of the body. I defined religion as a belief in a worship of gods. In that sense, none of these primitive peoples have any religion, but I would here extend the meaning of the word to include a belief in spirits. The first religious idea, not preceded by any sort of speculation about the animation of nature or awe of the powers of nature, is a belief in what we today call soul or spirit. Before I made this investigation into the beliefs of the lowest peoples, I considered that it was probably the sun and moon, the fire and the storm, that first impressed the imagination of early man and begot the religious feeling. It is clear that this is not so. Before man got wit enough to speculate on the cause of movements in nature, he believed in his own soul. Then we get important clues as to the origin of this belief in a soul. Let us be careful in using the words soul and spirit and immortality to remember that these dull-brained humans had no ideas corresponding to ours. The part of a man that survived death was material, though generally after death. Invisible, whether it lived forever, they never asked the question. They reply vaguely to it. All that they know is that it lives on. And we get a very clear idea why they suppose that there is a part of a man that lives on. Their word for it is commonly shadow, or it is a little red thing, like a man's shadow on water. Or the 9 peoples I have described, 3 plainly have no idea of survival, 2 are very doubtful, 4, the higher in culture, have an intense belief in it. Of the 4 who do definitely believe in survival, 2 call this surviving part of the man's shadow, and the other 2 say that it is a red object, though I cannot find the translation for their name for it. We shall see that even at higher levels, tribes still give the name shadow to the soul. So it appears that there is more meaning than we thought in the phrase shades of our ancestors. I do not wish to press any particular theory of the origin as an exclusive and universal fact, but these lowly peoples very clearly suggest that religion began with a crude speculation of primitive man about his own shadow. And this seems to me quite the most probable cause which the mind of each man would take. Sex life does not count in the earliest form of religion. Primitive man takes sex as a fact, like food. We leave the phallic theory to a later stage. On the other hand, nature worship, or the animation of nature, is not one of the earliest stages. Some of these peoples are said to have an awe for the sun and moon. This is certainly a germ of a religious feeling, but religion as a belief in personal human spirits or doubles clearly comes first. If we try to put ourselves in the mental atmosphere of a very lowly savage, we can understand it. He is incapable of abstract ideas. His mind is thoroughly concrete. A vague, general animation of nature is quite beyond him. He does not speculate on cause of movements, but definite concrete things begin to prick his curiosity. The sun and moon are too conspicuous, too solitary in the sky, too striking in their daily movements across it to be ignored. He begins to have a feeling of wonder about them, though not a definite opinion or speculation. But his own shadow is so near to him hourly, so weird in its movements, so plainly a double of himself, that it would be likely enough to be the first thing in nature he speculated about. Primitive man at this level had not the slightest idea of the sun's shade in the matter. No sun, no shadow, of course, but he had only to look into a pool or river to see it again. An exact duplicate of himself. It drew back into himself, spread out from himself, went with him everywhere. He must really be two beings, a body and a shadow. This gave him a clue to death. The shadow part had gone away. But it seems likely that dreams intervened here. While he slept on the ground, some part of him was out in the forest or on the river, the shadow part. We saw that the Brazilians who believed most intensely in spirits were great dreamers. Though their word for the soul was shadow, the shadow part wondered at night. When a man was found dead, his shadow part was not returned to the body. It still wondered, especially at night when everybody's shadow wondered. The world of the savage became peopled with shadows. So many men died. There is no such religion in this. The lowest people we saw had no such belief. To the next group, survival was simply a fact. They did not bother about the shadows. But in the next group, we find a belief that the shadows are malignant. Amongst the lowest peoples, few are malignant. As we shall see in studying the evolution of morals, the lowest peoples have no idea of a moral law, but they have very few vices. They live socially. Character gets worse as they rise in culture. We shall see why. And violent crimes multiply, so violent as malignant shades multiply. You must look out during the night. Now this is all that we find at the lowest level of humanity. When we set aside borrowed ideas and practices, it is the beginning, the germ of religion. It was fortunate for us that so many primitive patches of the race survived into our age of scientific curiosity. Before the end of this century, they will all probably be extinct, like the Tasmanians and the pure Vedas. From this level upward, we can still trace the evolution of religion by means of the savages who remain in the infancy of the race. But the tribes are now more numerous, the culture is more varied, and it would require a large volume or series of volumes to tell the story even in outline. All that I promise to do is to explain, by means of a few peoples at different levels, how men came to believe in gods, to have priests and temples, to practice worship and sacrifice. and we will first take the evolution of gods. But what is a god? We have already seen how in the mind of primitive man certain shadowy figures rise to a high or predominant position. The Vedas and others have no spirits, so there is no question of a god. Others, like the Tasmanians, have spirits, but nothing that stands out and could by any stretch of imagination be called a god. On the other hand, the Bushmen have Kaangu, and Andamanese have Paluga, and a second power, and the Semangs have carry and play. We must not attach too much importance to these. Kaang is to the Bushmen a great man of long ago. They never worship him. Paluga and his companion Power are said by one student of the Andamanese to be merely the monsoons, and Kari and Play seem to be borrowed from the Malays. The truth is that these lowly peoples have, as I said, no tribal organization and no chiefs. The spirit of the dead were equal as the living are. The clue to the evolution of God is, in other words, the rise of man to tribal organizations under chiefs. When men became hunters and fighters, and strong or cunning men gets chosen as leader, he becomes a chief. The leadership becomes hereditary. And as the spirit world is a duplicate to the living world, there are more powerful spirits in the world beyond the grave. Famous ancestors or former members of the tribe rise in the memory above all the ordinary spirits, who are individually forgotten. They are on the way to become gods, but it is a very gradual process, with all sorts of shades of belief, all degrees of goodness, so to say. Cottonmouth. So far, Herbert Spencer and Grant Allen seem to be right. Gods are at first deified or glorified chiefs or ancestors. But we must not suppose that religion evolved in precisely the same way everywhere. The glorification or deification of the sun and moon and other elements of nature was proceeding at the same time. It seems, however, that men got a definite belief in human spirits, some of which towered above others, before they imagined corresponding spirits in nature. The awe they sometimes show of the power in nature, the sun, the moon, and the storm, is not far removed from the feeling you can sometimes deduce from the expression of a dog watching a storm or a lion shrinking from fire. It is a very long way from this to the speculation that the visible storm or fire must have an invisible cause. The definite belief in spirits has to come first. Itchy nose. The proper way to trace the successive stages in the evolution of religion would be arrange savage tribes in the order of their culture or general development, and then see how religion rises from level to level. Most writers on comparative religion, instead of doing this, quote one tribe after another without noticing to which level of culture each belongs. The result is contradictory and confusing, and theories are wrong. Naturally, no one will expect to find in a tiny volume such as this an attempt at such a systematic work. But we will glance at a few peoples which are at the next level of culture to those we described in the last chapter. The Australian Aboriginals are at the next level of culture above the one we have described. They entered Australia ages ago. I should say certainly 50,000 years ago at least, for they correspond to man of the old Stone Age in Europe. Yet in some respects they rise above him. In any case, it is not disputed that they represent the next stage in man's evolution, and they are, therefore, most interesting from our present point of view. Many of them have for a century been in contact with the whites, but competent Australian scholars have studied them in their purest form and given us valuable accounts of them. Of these accounts, Spencer and Gillian's northern tribes of Central Australia and native tribes of Central Australia are the most authoritative. And the authors tell us that the Aboriginals, who have no number above 3, have no belief in anything like a supreme being. Howitt, the other chief authority, says that if by religion we mean worship of a god, the Australians have no religion. On the other hand, C. Strecklow, who also knows them well, asserts that some tribes have a sort of supreme being, as the Australians are always quoted on one side or the other. When the question is raised whether all peoples, even the lowest, believe in God, it would seem that we have here a perplexing contradiction. But, apart from the fact that the Australians are by no means amongst the lowest savages, it is a verbal quarrel. Strecklow says that the tribe he studied described their great being as a huge red-haired man with very large feet. Is that a deity? Some tribes talk of this being. He has various names, as having made the world, but here we clearly get the idea borrowed from missionaries. On the other hand, the tribes generally believe that there was an earlier age when their ancestors were beings of marvelous power and could make a river or a range of mountains, just as the bushman thinks some of his marvelous ancestors could make sun and moon by throwing their shoes into the sky. In a word, all the Australians believe firmly in a spirit part in man and in the reincarnation or successive embodiment of this underlying part. They believe in magic with the same intensity, and we have no reason to suppose that one preceded the other. They believe further that some of their ancestors were remarkably powerful beings, and that they remain powerful in the spirit world. They never pray to, or supplicate, or worship these beings, and they have no moral code presided over by them. The great ancestors, now great spirits, are simply facts. They have no priests and no temples, but there are hiding places for their ceremonial objects, which we might regard as the germ of temples. In fact, some tribes pick out one amongst the ancestral spirits, Bungil, Baami, Algera, etc., as a very special and powerful spirit. There is no sort of nature worship in animism. All this quite confirms the idea of the origin and development of religion and gods, which I have given. Now, at this higher level, there is no uncertainty whether about a man's spirit part. The race has got beyond that. Now also, since the peoples are organized in tribes and the tribes have chiefs, there are chiefs or headmen in the spirit world. It is no longer a complete democracy. In fine, in some tribes, one particularly powerful spirit is named above all others. It is not a god, but it is not far from it. Another black race is found on the islands north and east of Australia, and these Melanesians are on a higher stage than the Australians, though lower than most of the Africans. Their word for a man's spirit part is related to the word for shadow, and we may assume that their belief arose in the way described. They are, however, still vague about their future life, and though they put the dead man's weapons in his grave, they deny that this means a belief that his spirit will use them. Some of the tribes believe definitely in punishment in a future life, and it warns us against not to read our spiritual ideas into the savage mind when we learn that the punishment was administered on the part on which old-fashioned schoolmasters used to punish boys. There are still no gods, but as in Australia, there are approaches to a divine condition. In many of the islands, particularly powerful spirits are venerated, and in cases it is said that they are the spirits of a former human beings, sometimes chiefs. Sacrifices are offered to them, but their help is invoked. Sacrifices are offered to them, their help is invoked, and little houses built over their supposed remains represent the germ of temples. At this point, something in the nature of priests, though not formal priesthoods, appear The wizard or the chief has to offer the propitiatory sacrifices, and he gains a quasi-sacred character. But we will consider that in the next chapter. The Melanesians are especially interesting because they believe in a kind of an impersonal supernatural influence diffused through nature, which they call mana. A good knife, a shark, a curious stone, or a tree may have mana. A man wants it. One almost thinks of the American pep and believes he gets it by eating a strong man. Now, we saw that one of the current theories of the origin of religion is that it began in a vague belief in some such vague force or virtue in nature generally, and those who hold the theory illustrate it from the Melanesian mana. But the Melanesians are very far from primitive. Their ideas entirely confirm the line of evolution which I suggested. Let's see, I think we'll stop there for part 2. And, yep, that's where we'll stop. We'll stop there for part 2. And thanks for listening, and I'll see you in part 3 of The Origin of Religion. Little Blue Book number 1008, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening.